Greeting everyone, and welcome to the NYC Complexity Lounge, which is a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and somewhere around in one of those floating boxes is the lovely and talented Barbara Frontera, and together we co-host the lounge. Before we kick off, just a few ground rules. We will be recording today's session, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please make sure that your camera and microphone are turned off. We also ask that you please keep the side chat activity to a minimum during Sue's talk. And after her talk, we'll have a Q&A session, and you can either raise your hand or just send your questions directly to Barbara via chat. The recording will be posted to Vimeo on our NYC Complexity Lounge page in the next couple of days, and that's also where you can find all of our past videos from the lounge. Our guest today is Sue Borchardt. I hope I pronounced that right, Sue. And Sue is a research artist who spends her time thinking about how to foster more humane and reflective practices in business, community, nonprofits, and government. Her work weaves ideas, storytelling, art, and first-person experience into animated videos and visual artifacts that put sense-making into service. In addition to a master's in human development and psychology, she holds a bachelor's in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. Quite impressive. Today, she will be sharing a couple of her animated short videos, a few of her favorite articulations of complexity topics and concepts, and take us on a tour of some of the complexity-informed theories, models, frameworks, insights, and tools that have taken up residency in her repertoire. If there's time and interest, we might even map a bit of our collective landscape of complexity ideas and insights in real time. I don't know about you, but that sounds exciting to me. Sue, welcome to the Complexity Lounge.
Thank you. I guess I don't need to introduce myself since I was just introduced. It feels a little strange because that was my sort of opening plan.
I stole the thunder. Sorry about that.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. Go ahead, Sue. You know, Jocko doesn't do a very good job anyway, so it's...
Oh, Borchardt.
So I thought I would use a framework from Marshall Gans, who teaches a course at the Kennedy School of Government called Public Narrative. And his frame for public narrative is the story of self, the story of us, the story of now. And so the story of self would be all of ourselves, but since I have the floor, it's the story of this self as the sort of opener. I'm going to share my screen here so that you get the benefit of sort of what I'm using to frame my thinking. This is a Kumu map that turned into a giant brain dump in preparing for this talk, and it's just what I sort of went with. Little quick, I also want to share this Kumu map with you all in chat in case you want to kind of explore. I'll do that in a few minutes, but just a quick overview of how Kumu works. Notice that I keep clicking on this thing that says visual sense-making narratives and nothing's happening, but this little 3-arrow dot on the left is like kind of bouncing. So if you click on it, I don't know why it doesn't just automatically do it, but if you click on it, it brings up like a little detail for whatever element you have selected in the map. So this is actually another Kumu map. If I click on it, it's going to bring up a light box of that Kumu map. And this is almost, I thought it was every animation I had ever made, but it's almost every animation I've ever made. I found 4 missing this morning from my early days. But they're links directly to a little bit of info. Again, when you gotta kind of roll out. It's got a URL for whatever animation is being is represented there. It shows what year I made it, and that is accessible all the time if people want to explore it. There's a lot of animations on here. Everything in the bottom, I think it's something like, I don't know how many, 28-ish animations. I guess I could just select and find out. It is, in fact, 25 animations that I made at the Learning Innovations Lab, which is where I pretty much learned how to do what I do, which is make videos that sort of represent insights and puzzles, preferably with some provocation from a researcher or a practitioner or someone who has an interesting theory. And then I just sort of push those ideas around using the insights and puzzles and perhaps ideas for actions that the people like you, whoever's gathered making sense of some research, comes up with. I try and sort of put them into a narrative. So I'm going to close this back down and go back to our original map. So I added, basically, in trying to figure out what to talk about today, well, it'll be really interesting to see what I talk about today, because in trying to figure it out, I sort of took this deep dive back to thinking about, like, when did I first hear about complexity and what were all the different domains that I was exploring? And why did it feel like a really useful sort of, I don't know what to call it, framework or discipline, illuminating theories on how the world worked? Why did I latch onto it and when? And you can see there's a lot of domains here. Oh, I just heard the ding dong. Sorry, Jocko, ding dong's still happening. So we have a lot of domains here. Neuroscience and contemplative science were probably the two that really, and cognitive science, I guess, began my interest in complexity. More recently, I've just gotten really into more of the molecular biology. Group learning came when I was in grad school. So I'm gonna do a little bit of violence here to your brains and show you the whole map. So this isn't even the whole map. This is the curated, edited, honed map, because the original was, it was never ending. And so I created just sort of some touch points here. They're these big gray boxes, which are sort of my guide today through this pretty messy map. And I want to share in the chat the URL for this so you all can kind of explore it on your own. Even while I'm talking is fine. Like, you may have things you see that you want me to talk about, or things that once you click on it and you see how I explain it, you think, oh, okay, that makes sense, or not. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is just fun stuff that I have come across. I love epiphanies. Every little yellow light bulb here is what I call a big idea or an epiphany. And it's funny because some of the old ones I look at, well, okay, that one's probably one that nobody's ever heard of, but let's see what some other ones, like paradox. us adults don't usually think about paradox as an epiphany, but it was at one time. I still remember when I was like, oh, wow, like paradox is like a real thing that I have to deal with. It's not just some puzzle that like Bertrand Russell put out or something. I don't know, I'm just throwing random names out, but like the sort of logic-y philosopher types who give you those like all cretins or liars puzzles. Like that didn't really do much for me at all. But like actual paradoxes, that was an epiphany. So I've sprinkled those around. They're the light bulb thingies. And in hindsight, like today, we might not think of those as big ideas at all, but I put them on there because of, I'm sure you've all heard of the curse of knowledge. Like once you know something, it's really hard to remember that there was a time when you didn't know it. So one of the things I've come across that lately that just felt mind-boggling was this notion of why can't I select that little driver? Bow ties and hourglasses. So this is an idea that I came across from reading about the theory of graceful extensibility from David Woods, which is a theory that I don't know that I have a handle on, frankly. I made a whole Kumu map of it, just laying out the theory so I could figure out, like, what is he talking about? That's one version. I have a more sort of clean, linear version of David Woods's theory. But I was playing with it. I liked the ideas, but then it took me like a year to really get through it. And then I started exploring some of the references that he cites. And there were two groups of thinkers. There was the Gerhardt and Kirchner, who wrote this book, Cells, Embryos. The little green things on the map are people. So you can see Mark Kirchner and John Gerhardt wrote Cells, Embryos, and Evolution. It touches on the domains of evolution and molecular biology and cell biology in the field of biology. And it was this thread here from the theory of graceful extensibility through tangled layered networks that led me to Cells, Embryos, and Evolution, which is really hilarious because I had this book on my bookshelf and didn't even know I had it. But the paper that they wrote on evolvability was what Woods referenced. So that also led me to Doyle and Seaty. I don't know how you pronounce Marie Seaty's last name, but she was the co-author of a paper on architecture, constraints, and behavior. And they're the ones that named this bow ties and hourglasses things, bow ties and hourglasses. Basically, Kirchner and Gerhardt call it constraints that deconstrain. And their example that they use is microtubules. And not many people know what a microtubule is. And I'm going to torment you. This is the great thing about having the floor, is that I get to talk about whatever I want to. Sonia Blicknow, every time I start talking about microtubules, she's like, like, stop now. So they are these little polymerizing, it's like tubulin. It's like a little molecule that self-assembles into what looks like a hollow cord. So I actually have a video somewhere on this board. I'm not sure where I put it. Maybe it's under bow ties and hourglasses. Yeah, okay. So here you can see a little video, which I'm not going to unmute because it's really loud. Those are microtubules polymerizing and depolymerizing. So they're assembling and disassembling making these highways in the cell that allow stuff to move, like this giant vesicle using a little motor protein. They make up, if you use a similar one, actin, I'm going to stop this now, a similar thing creates that whole cytoskeleton in the cell. So why is this so fascinating? So microtubules create what you could think of as an hourglass. If you think about, I wonder if I can annotate real quick. Let's try this. Draw. All right, I'm going to try and draw real quick and see if it works. Yeah, okay. If you think about like layers of organizing, like cells and cell parts, and organizing into other layers and layers upon layers, sometimes there are these knots, and microtubules are one of these knots of organizing, a constraint that deconstrains. And so one of the things that these guys, Gerhardt and Kirschner, describe when they describe microtubules is the way that this highly conserved feature has transcended the entire, I think, metazoan kingdom in biology. Like, that is just how cells work. And the thing that I think is an illustrative example is cell division. So when a cell is going to divide, there are these things, I think they're called like centrosomes, and the micro, is this too small? Can you guys see what I'm drawing here?
I can see it. I can see it. Yeah.
Thanks. The centrosomes, like they start to just send out microtubules in a million different directions, and there's 2 of them. And basically, what they do is they allow a full complement of the chromosomes in the middle. You got, your 2 sets. They attach to these microtubules so that they can be pulled apart, so that you end up with a full set of the chromosomes in each side of the cell that got divided, the 2 that got created. Okay, why does this matter? Okay, here's where it gets good. I know you guys are probably glazing over here with all this biology. What makes this possible is the microtubules retain an ability to be random. There's never a rut in the highway of microtubules building their little, building and dissolving in a matter of seconds. Sometimes the lifespan of one of these little highways could be about 30 seconds. But they maintain randomness of directions. They just shoot these things out, and because there are so many of these highways so quickly, there's a likelihood that the chromosome will just bump into one, and then it attaches to it. So that when the cell division happens, you get the full complement of chromosomes in each cell. So it is this randomness that is really difficult to preserve. It takes a lot of energy to preserve this randomness. So that is a whole lot of blah, blah, blah on what is essentially, for me, a really intriguing metaphor to play with. So I think a lot about oh geez, somebody is knocking on my door, and let me just tell you, this never happens. I live in a condo on the 6th floor. So I'm gonna ignore that. Hopefully the building's not on fire. I'm gonna stop annotating if I can figure out how to. Okay, so that made me lose my train of thought a little bit. In terms of analogies, Doyle and CT have some good ones here. So if anybody reads this paper, Architectural Constraints and Behavior, they have some fun human examples of this, or in processes, they use like the entire sort of craft of sewing as it transcends, epochs and eras, and how like the creation of seams in garments is in some ways a bow tie of practice, of how you assemble and architect structures. So that was one of my little data points, my little fun things was bow ties and hourglasses. These are going to feel a little disjoint. You'd think that being someone who makes narratives for a living, I'd be better at telling stories, but I'm not in real time, which is why I make animations. So another little data point here is this idea of simplexity and complicity. So this book here, Figments of Reality, was one of my first introductions to complexity. I love this book. It's written by a mathematician and a biologist, and they use a lot of game theory to try and illustrate things like phase space. And they have this notion of simplexity and complicity. So I wanted to read a little bit. So rather than me try and explain what they explained, just like share with you why I think it's so fun, or not why, but like what they wrote that really I latched onto that I felt was really fun. So this is from chapter 3. It's called Ant Country, A-N-T. And they're not really talking about ant colonies so much as something else, which you'll see, this idea of simplexity and complicity. So I say there's a parasitic flatworm. Oh, I'm going to stop sharing while I do this, if that's okay. Okay. There's a parasitic flatworm that spends part of its life inside an ant, while its reproductive stage is inside a cow. The technique that has evolved to effect the transfer from one animal to the other shows just how subtle the effects of blind evolution can be. The parasite infects the ant and presses on a particular part of its brain. This interferes with the normal behavior of the brain, which causes the ant to climb a grass stem, grasp it with its jaws, and hang there, permanently attached. So when a cow comes along and eats the grass, the parasite enters the cow. So many pages later, they refer back to this. And they talk about, by introducing this idea of simplexity and complicity. So by recombining elements of simplicity and complexity, we end up with the words simplexity and complicity. We attach the word simplexity to emergence of the kind exemplified by the highways of ant colonies. So simplexity is just sort of the emergence of those pheromone trails that a lot of us have heard about. So these are large-scale features, like the ant trails, that occur within a single rule-based system, but whose detailed deduction from the rules is enormously lengthy and uninformative, or perhaps unknown. Complicity is far more elusive, but also far more important. And we will use it as a central image throughout Figments. It occurs when two or more rule-based systems interact, when two separate phase spaces join forces to grow a joint phase space that feeds back into both components and changes them recursively until after a while hardly any trace of their original separate forms can be found. As we indicated at the start of this chapter, a real-world example of complicity is the evolution of the remarkable ant-cow parasite system. It is at least a three-way complicity, whose component systems include the ant's brain and the cow's grazing habits, as well as the parasite. The ant's brain evolved the ability to grasp stems and let go again, because this was a useful thing for an ant to be able to do. The cow evolved a liking for grass because that was good for the evolution of cows. Lurking in the combined phase space with grass as the connecting feature was a horrible trap which the parasite discovered by accident The resulting behavior makes no sense either in ant space or cow space alone, but it got built into their combined phase spaces because it set up a beautiful snooker break for the parasite. So the snooker break is something that the authors of Figments use a lot in their game theory frame, which is sort of like when I have never played snooker, but I guess it's like a lot of games in pool where you play pool where you're not just looking at sinking the ball, you're looking at setting up your next shot or a whole series of shots. So they talk about that in evolutionary game space a lot. So those that is another stop on my little way station here through this horrendous map. So I'm wondering, that was a lot of talking. That was probably a good 25 minutes of talking. So there's a couple places we could go next. We could stop now for a little Q&A before we go further. We can go a little bit more into sort of what really drives my curiosity, like moves we can make and thinking together and how to do that well. Maybe I should ask, does anybody have a burning question? Does anybody have a thought about? Yeah?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Does anybody have anything that they want Sue to clarify? They want to go a little more deeply on? Speak now, or Sue's going to move on. Raise your hand. No, I guess that was clear.
Okay.
Yay team. So,
okay.
Sue, continue.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to reshare my screen here. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit to, I'm going to go to this next one. It's not really backtracking. We're going forward to moves we can make. And the reason this kind of entered into my thinking a lot is because of conversations with David Woods on his theory of graceful extensibility. In those conversations, he often, he comes from a background of engineering and robotics and where you're developing sensory motor systems. And he talks a lot about how you need to show the camera. You need to show where the camera is. To really, like, you can move the camera maybe around in a system, but can you also, when you have the camera relating to the system, trying to make sense of the system, let's say it's rolling around on a robot or it's rolling around on a person, can you actually bump out and also show a map of, okay, given what I'm seeing, can you also show me where the camera is in that system? And that led me down this horrendous rabbit hole of an animation. Honestly, it has no sound. I'm going to show it to you here. Can you all see that? Okay, so this, I tried to make a system where I could be the camera, because, I could make a camera. The camera's the viewpoint. I can make multiple cameras in After Effects. I can move them around. I can zoom in and out, which are different things, by the way. Zooming and moving, even though they sometimes have the same effect, they are different in the model of a camera and a person even. I can change my focus, like I can change my depth of focus. If anybody's a camera person, if you narrow the aperture, let less light in, you actually increase how deeply things are in focus. I can turn my head so that I might be able to see the edges of whatever I'm in the midst of. I can change, like here all I did was I zoomed way out and now I'm going to focus on things that are close to me. Now I'm moving back inside the system here. And I think I look at the ground next. It's sort of this random thing. You won't believe this. Well, I don't believe this. But this minute and 40 seconds took my computer about 48 hours to render. It's a really cheesy simulation of a system, and it's not agent-based or emergent at all. I just made the thing. But one of the things that inspired this was my understanding of how attention works. So the models that describe attention are to think of it like a beam of light. So you see this beam of light, and you can narrow and expand the beam of light. You can move it around. And that's one of the models that neuroscientists have used to understand attention. And so not only can we move as a person, not only can we move our camera and make all those other moves about like, what am I focusing on? Am I focusing on the team? Or am I focusing on the organization? Am I actually going to talk to people in the C-suite? Or if I'm a leader, on the production line. I can not only move my camera as a person, the beam of my attention does not always follow my eyes. I can separate these two things, which is kind of a radical idea, and one that I did not even have any sense of. And I did a stint in a research lab that studied attention and working memory, which is somewhere on here. I just zoomed in, but I don't think it's worth finding. And we would try and set up psychometric experiments where we would give people these tasks where we're like, okay, we want you to attend to this thing in your peripheral vision, but we don't want you to look at it. And it's almost like learning to play an instrument. You're like, what? Your eyes just go there because somebody has asked you to report something about what they're seeing in their peripheral vision, and your eyes just want to go look at it. But if you want to study attention, you sort of need to tease apart vision and that attentional beam of light. Attentional beam of light. Yeah, we actually had to dismiss some study subjects because they simply couldn't do the task. It was interesting. So this question of what are the moves we can make, there is that little camera thing, but there's also this idea that struck me during the network exploratory with Valdez Krebs that Cognitive Edge hosted. And it was also about like when you look and how often you look. So I made this goofy little thing to illustrate this point. So what we have here are 4 views of the same motion. We have circular motion with the X and Y phase shifted just a little bit by like a few degrees. And what it does, if you were to be able to sample rapidly, you would see the shape that's emerging up here in the top left. But let's say you only sampled 1 time a second. You only looked in that direction. Your eyes only made that camera move once a second. You would see a line. And you would think, this thing I'm observing is just a line. If you do it 2.5 times a second, down here in the bottom left, you see what looks like a bunch of lines, maybe, vertical lines. And if you do, I just picked these things at random, 3.75 times per second, we're actually getting closer to the the actual shape, but it almost looks the most random in the bottom right here. So when you look, and the temporality of it is really critical. And then also about what moves we can make that sort of bridges this gap of thinking together was I did a stint in grad school, a rather long stint with Daniel Wilson on conversation analysis, where we would take the conversations that were happening at the Learning Innovations Lab, which is where I made all those animations, and we would record the breakout sessions that people were having. And then we'd do these deep dives and, multiple people coding and looking for sort of conversational moves. And Daniel had done similar research with adventure racing teams in his PhD. And that's this, well, it's not, he actually built on this much later, the language of, he calls it the languages of learning in groups here. I think I sometimes call it the language of well, collaboration has a little bit too evaluative of a name, but I still think of it sometimes. But I think, like, what types of conversational moves help a team, whatever, like, think together? And what kind of conversational moves seem to get in the way of a team thinking together? And so, we've got some things here, like somebody makes a declaration and I think it's a stupid idea. I might just dismiss it or ignore it. I might also clarify. I might say, like, okay, I'm not getting what you're saying. Can you say more about that? And so that's just an example. This bottom one, the last one, scatter and thread, this was a skill that I had to develop at the Learning Innovations Lab because I never, in conversations, especially when you have like 35 people trying to have a conversation together about a really interesting topic, if you're the third person offering some insight or something that landed with you, and you're not building or connecting back or threading to what the speaker said, it makes it really hard for the group to sort of think together. And so just this idea of threading is often really useful in sort of helping the knowledge landscape emerge in a group. And lastly, I'm going to talk about, in terms of moves we can make, thinking moves. So I'm going to uncheck this and check this real quick, which is going to be a little jarring, but okay. So I did an animation with Project Zero, which is it's been around for about 50 years. Its original mission was learning in and through the arts. And Project Zero is now just probably, I don't even know how many research projects are there. It's well beyond learning in and through the arts. But they have developed over the years thinking routines. So there's another Kumu map. You can access all these maps. There's an animation that tells you a little bit about what a thinking routine is, if you want to watch that. But this is a map of thinking moves. And everything in orange is a thinking routine. It's basically like a protocol. And the teal things here are thinking moves, like the move to describe something or to interpret something or observe something. And this has emerged from over the years at Project Zero. But I've started to think about, the energy that it takes to maintain randomness in conversation and in thinking together. So the bow ties and hourglasses of our thinking together. If we, borrowing from Dave Snowden's thinking on ritualizing randomness, well, he doesn't, Dave, I know you don't say randomness, but like ritualizing, I'm going to say, what happens if we ritualize randomness? In some ways, these little protocols like See, Think, Wonder help us do that. Like See, Think, Wonder is a protocol that it's really simple. It's just, what do you see? Do you act like that you actually notice, that we can all point to? What does it make you think? And what does it make you wonder? And it helps us tease apart where we've gotten interpretation, evaluation, prescription, description. We've got all these things kind of wrapped around the axle, so we're not really thinking well together. If we can ritualize just some of these moves, it can help us think together, is sort of my idea, or belief, I would say. I didn't come up with it, but it occurred to me this morning, there's another one of these that came from, many of you might have read Joseph Henrich's book, The Secret to Our Success, or his latest book, The Weirdest People in the World. He talks about culture, which is on here somewhere. And the way that cultural evolution follows the same rules as genetic evolution, and both influence biology. So in one of the examples that he gives in the book, which I don't have on the board, so I'm not going to try and find it, is the way that certain cultures would ritualize sort of the throwing of like runes to see where, I don't know if I'm using it, like it was like bones or chicken bones or something to divine, like these practices of rituals of divination to figure out where to plant crops each year. So it essentially codified a way to randomize planting, so crop rotation, so that you weren't depleting the resources of the fields and having crop failures. So take a thousand foot view here and step back. I was sharing with Barbara and Jaco before the call started that this morning I remembered an animation. It was the fourth animation I ever made, and it was on complexity. It's terrible. And I went, but I thought, maybe that would be fun to show people because it's so bad. And it tells you sort of, in a way, it gives you a snapshot of, in 2010, how was I thinking about complexity? And it made me think of this thing that I learned from Michael Muthakrishna. So I met Michael at Lila. He was the Learning Innovations Lab. He was a guest when we did a whole year on cultural adaptation. And then Michael and I collaborated on a series of 3 animations on cultural evolution. And there was one there, which would probably be far more fun to watch, and is also linked on here, that was on, I'm just going to search for culture. There we go. So another like big idea that was in that one is the illusion of explanatory depth. So one of the reasons I like making videos is because it's it's a way to let me know what I know. I try not to be too explaining with them because who wants to just sit around and listen to an explanation? There are lots of other reasons as well, but it also reveals your illusions around your own explanatory depth. When I try and tell the story of microtubules or whatever, I'm like, oh my God, did I get that right? Metazoan kingdom? Is that the right kingdom? I'm not sure. Do I have an illusion that I actually understand how microtubules work? Probably. And it's in the telling that those get revealed to us. So again, I'm going to press pause here for a sec. We can look at a 10-year-old animation. We can look at the second in the game theory series here, or the cultural evolution series that talks about illusion of explanatory depth. We're approaching the top of the hour. We can do Q&A. We can do mapping some landscapes. I am at your service. Does anybody feel free to shoot something in the chat if you have an opinion about what happens next.
More video, more video.
Yes, Jocko loves the videos.
Jocko says more videos. Anybody else want to chime in? Preference? Anybody want to roll up their sleeves and fight me?
Yeah, I'm seeing like video.
Just kidding,
Everybody's
Dave.
like video in the chat. Video, more video. We love the videos. Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay. We got one mapping. We got one video, one mapping. All right. All right. You want? I'm not going to inflict the 10-year-old. Oh,
we do want to see.
Okay.
We do want to see. Like, I'd like to see them side by side. You know,
okay.
one after the other.
I will do for you. Okay. Let's see. Share screen. I think I have.
Oh, Bruce has a question. Bruce, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks. So, Sue, you mentioned temporality and a dimension of all this complexity stuff that I find too often overlooked. And so when I see your animations and your emphasis on animation, I'm curious, do you think about or how do you address the aspect of time? Animation is stuff in motion over time. So are you consciously applying different sort of time dynamics to your animations when you make them in line with what you understand to be the complexity of what you're trying to convey?
Yeah, I fear this is going to be a really unsatisfying answer, but it's the one I have.
It's okay.
When I first started animating, and you'll see it here, if anything had to move, it was linear motion. And our eyes do not like linear motion. They want springiness. They want organic, sort of easing in, easing out, and overshoot. You know, the animators, the cell drawing animation folks knew this like crazy. So that is something that I had to learn about, sort of organic movement. But in terms of complexity, I constantly feel hamstrung by my tools. Because as I tell you, that one system which doesn't have anything agent-based in it, which is not supported by any of the tools that I use, like the industry standard motion graphics tools, don't support anything like an agent-based modeling or simulation. It's so frustrating, but even that one took 2 days to render. So I constantly feel like I'm butting up against having linear tools to communicate complex stuff, or inadequate tools, let's say. Okay, so we'll go with the 12-year-old animation here. Let me do a share screen. And I think I muted this tab, so I'm going to have to make sure that I unmute it. All right, and I might have to mute this at times if y'all are having trouble with this, because the audio is so bad. Like, Baby Sue made this. She didn't know what she was doing. Like, it's like my ukulele is making it really hard to hear the voiceover at times. Okay, so I've unmuted it. I'm going to go full screen. Hopefully you guys can see that. And
we left Franz contemplating a paradox of mastery and flow states. If being in the zone feels like what you're doing is doing itself, then who is doing the doing? Franz was oddly thrilled to discover he was not the only person to wrestle with this question, and he'd found some thought-provoking ideas on the phenomenon of self-organization seen throughout the natural world. These folks suggest that cells, hurricanes, flowers, immune systems, and people self-organize. Franz thought it was all very interesting, but surely things don't just organize themselves. Without some sort of leader, or at least a set of rules, nothing will ever organize. It's all just chaos. With that last thought, Franz had hit on a key aspect of self-organizing systems. Large numbers of independent agents interacting according to a set of rules can form systems with emergent properties that could not have been predicted. These systems can then act as agents in yet another level of self-organizing system. So while it may appear that these agents are independent, they are actually interdependent. These ideas, though on completely different scales and radically different contexts, share common dynamics, and when enough scientists bopped their heads up long enough to recognize a pattern that transcended their fields of study, the result was the science of complexity. The difference between a hurricane and an ant colony is in how well they maintain themselves. The hurricane self-organizes, but it doesn't adapt very well. It dies relatively quickly when challenged with a landmass. An ant colony, on the other hand, will adapt to challenges such as a flood in the nest or an obstruction of the food line. Because it self-organizes, maintains itself in the face of challenges, and exhibits emergent properties, the ant colony is considered a complex adaptive system. Franz had two burning questions about these systems. How do they know the queen isn't running the show and telling the ants what to do? And how could a system like an ant colony adapt if all the ants just followed the same set of rules? One way they know the queen doesn't run the show is by plugging in the rules of being an ant into simulated ants to see if the same kinds of emergent phenomena show up. The rules include 1. Follow any pheromone trail you find. 2. Touch antenna with any ant you meet. And 3. If you come across too many foragers, switch from foraging to trash collecting. These rules encode both positive and negative feedback into the system. Given enough ants following ant rules, food lines form, and cemetery and trash dump emerge. Even the relative distances between food stores, trash, and cemetery is consistently optimized. For a self-organizing system of rule-based agents to adapt, some of its agents, ants in this case, need to break the rules. This rule breaking in small doses allows systems to stumble on solutions to problems. For instance, the ant that wanders off the pheromone trail is more likely to discover a new food source. Other examples of disorder introducing variation include recombination through sexual reproduction in evolutionary biology, and human acts of creativity such as Rosa Parks' act of civil disobedience. In self-organizing adaptive systems, the balance between following rules and breaking them is a delicate one. Too much disorder and the system falls apart, or fails to organize in the first place. Too little disorder and the system has no means for finding solutions to challenges and dies rather than adapting. For instance, when the immune system fails to invent an antibody to an invading antigen. Franz had to admit he liked the idea that there were organizing forces in the universe, and while he wasn't ready to buy into it, he was willing to stay open to new data. After all, it's not like the world is only moving towards chaos. Flowers still come into being, and he supposed it was possible that this happened in a self-organizing way. But Franz wanted to know, what does any of this have to do with doing and the sense of agency and flow states? Ponder this, Franz. If you and your brain are self-organizing systems, then even your sense of self, agency, and even your conscious awareness are emergent properties of a complex adaptive system. While your top-down emergent executive function is real, all the other bottom-up influences that brought it into being are still in play.
I'm going to stop it there. There's little references that come afterwards, but that's plenty. You can notice how it's very wordy. There's a lot of words on the screen. Let's see. That's the whole Franz series. If anybody wants to look at it, it's up on Vimeo. And it references back to like earlier ones like flow states and okay, let's see if I can find the one that I had thought about sharing the cultural evolution one because it's got that illusion of explanatory depth and it's really fun. But I was also thinking about the dissipative structures one because it's a little bit more focused on emergence. So does anybody want to preference game theory and the illusion of explanatory depth a la cultural evolution, or dissipative structures and emergence translated to organizations? Preference, anyone? Oh, I'm seeing some things in the chat. Let's see.
Yeah, well, Bruce wants to know. It's Franz, yeah. Bruce wants to know about Franz.
Character that I created for it's. If you watch the whole series, and it is really painfully bad audio, Bruce. But if you watch the whole series, Franz is introduced in the first one.
Subi, how about your second one, your organizational one?
The dissipative structures. Ooh, interesting thought. Okay. Okay, let's see. That was in the year on emergence. I think it was this one. Okay. Let's see. I have to get there. Okay. And this is probably going to pop up in another tab. Yep. Okay. Let's see. And it'll be really curious because I don't know if I'm already like trying to make excuses for why this one might not even be as good as that one in 2010. Let's see. Okay.
Oh, never apologize, Sue.
I know. Yes, we're our harshest critics. Artists, man. Whew. Okay.
Sometimes it seems like it would be easier to start from scratch than to achieve wide-scale change in an organization. This might explain in part why restructuring is so common. The science of complexity offers insights into why this rarely results in lasting change. Emergence, the arising of ordered systems, both natural and human, can be viewed from many angles within complexity science. A map of emergence can be gleaned from the way patterns and forms that dissipate energy emerge in a thermodynamic system. Let's say you have a pot of water at equilibrium. While it might sound non-intuitive, this system is at its most disordered since there's no discernible pattern. A flame under the pot adds energy to the system, moving it away from equilibrium. As a result, patterns arise, for instance, temperature gradients, motion, and convection cells. If we push the system far from equilibrium, surprising structures can emerge. Applying this lens to organizations reveals parallels in how they form and transform. For example, a company with a history of strong performance might notice that their distribution channels are increasingly at odds with how retail stores are getting their stock. This growing sense that the status is definitely not quo increases stress, triggering explorations and novel experimentation. Performance suffers as a result, and perhaps there's an uptick of gossip as folks try to sort through it all. Experiments with several new distribution strategies gain traction, pulling the system forward, while other forces, for instance, defensive routines, pull the organization back to the way things have always been done. Over time, if a tipping point is reached, a new stable state emerges, one with greater capacity for getting products to retailers. It's important to note that what emerges and when is unpredictable, so how then can we manage this? In fact, we already do, but efforts to control the outcomes often reinforce old structures. Mechanized processes and rigid reporting structures do help us cope with the anxiety of uncertainty and change, and they have also been key parts of successful strategies for driving efficiency. Unfortunately, they leave little slack for the messiness of inventing adaptive responses. Suspending the way things have always been done, the deep structure, is indeed messy and can feel like discipline has gone out the window. Paradoxically, it takes even greater discipline to resist the urge to revert to the old rules, to intentionally unlearn what has worked so well thus far. But how do we muster intention that is itself emergent? This challenge to the conventional belief that intention precedes action is one of several that the theory of creative action invites us to rethink if we are to leverage emergence. The theory suggests that individuals are expressive processes, and we must express our embodiment to thrive. So what happens in a workplace that tells us to check our emotions at the door? If, as the theory suggests, we don't just think things through and choose the most rational path, and we don't blindly act out our social conditioning either, then how do we make sense of ourselves and our experiences? The answer is we do it together. For clues to rehumanizing and enlivening our work, we might look to the Celtic bards. In listening to and telling stories of their clans, bards wove together the downstream view of what has already happened with the upstream view of possible futures. Could a new, perhaps more distributed bardic tradition help us sense, share, and shape our stories, tuning into currents both subtle and sudden? While emergencies demand our attention, attention must be paid if we're to notice the gradual quickening of our organizational rhythms, an early sign of emerging trouble or opportunity. Bardism might be one way of leaning into instability before emergencies arise, in effect, conditioning emergence. What else might emerge if we summon the courage to go far from the comfort of our own equilibrium? We'll dive into this and other questions in our next exploration of emergence.
Okay, what next? There are two things that we have not touched on at all in my public narrative frame. The story of us and the story of now. We can get a sense of both of those things through conversation or Q&A or mapping.
Zubia, something showed up for me, and I'm not sure how to piece it together and everything you just presented. And it goes back to the little tickler around throwing the bones to plant. Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm forgetting what you link that to. What was that hook to? The throwing.
Yeah. The way that the biologists describe it, or the evolutionary folk, is a highly conserved practice to ensure randomness. So it is a constraint that deconstrains, in effect. It keeps evolvability alive, basically.
Yeah. It's just such a great little snippet of so many of my clients I'm working with right now, looking at, well, moving, I guess for so long the word was sustainability, and realizing now we have to go beyond, right? We have to go to regenerative. But just taking the land and being so structured and planting crops over and over, like depleting. And so, and I think of organizations, the trying to be efficient becomes so inefficient. And there's the beauty of throwing the bones. There's this constraint that allows for this other thing to happen, that allows for regenerative fields or regenerative states. and just your structured box in that last video linked back to me again saying, when do we constrain and what is the downside of that and where's the loosening of it, and just the little point you made there. So that was a great little illustrative of that.
I just pasted the, and thank you for looping back to that, Joyce. I pasted the Kumu map link again, in case folks want to explore it. I mean, we could also do a critical exploration of the map. See, think, wonder. What do you notice?
Any burning questions? You know, in all the stuff that Sue covered, don't be shy. If if there's something you want Sue to talk about a little more, or there's something you don't understand, please raise your hand. We really want this to be a dialogue if we can make it happen. You know, for me, Sue, what was really interesting was that idea of the camera and where your focus is. But so often, our brains extrapolate the rest of the picture from where our focus is, right? Like we think we know what's happening all around that narrow focus we've taken.
Yeah, it's very much like that that video with the sampling where you get a line, because our eyes zip around and assemble the pattern, like you say, Barbara. Like it's a fascinating thing. I'm wondering if anybody's going to notice that I have the behaviorists on my map. Which, if it were me and I was a viewer, I would flag that and be like, "What the heck you got that on there for?" I see something in the chat, and also I see Andrew has a hand raised. Andrew,
yes, he does. Yes,
fire away.
Andrew.
I am now unmuted. Yeah, I did see the behaviorists with my psych background. It's funny to point it out. What I wanted to ask you about is related to Bardism, because in my graduate studies, there was a program there that was very heavy on the power of narrative, and that's something I've seen in my consulting work as well, being a heavy focus. And I was wondering if there was a way for you to just delve into that a little bit and maybe connect it to the story of us, because that's one of the things that I have, discussed in reference to this group and complexity science in general as being this kind of evolving narrative, and there's a meta element of it. So I was hoping to get a little bit more information on Bardism from your perspective, and then tie it into the story of us.
So the that word came from sorry, I'm laughing at the chat. That word came from Donald McLean, who visited the Learning Innovations Lab and had us flocking like birds. And I'm wondering about it. It seems to me there is this need for a distributed public narrative in order for it to perhaps skirt the magnetic pull of a single story. I don't know. I'm thinking about a notion that it actually is not on the map, but epistemic injustice, or if you flip it around, epistemic justice. And it comes with a parallel, which is sort of hermeneutic, like who gets to interpret what we're seeing and who gets to tell the story of it. And it's interesting because there's a tie-in. Note, I am going to try and thread right now. So as a conversational move, I'm going to flag this puppy. There's a link to the behaviorist there, because I ended up in a class on behaviorism by accident because I was interested in learning, and that was what the course was called. And I discovered it was a behaviorist class, and I'm like, ew, I'm dropping this thing. And then I was like, well, hang on. You know, if I really want to like rip it up, if I want to tear this house down, I should understand it. And I took the course, and one of the things it really highlighted for me was like, holy cow, was there a lot of interesting data there. It's just that I didn't agree with the interpretation of it. And so teasing that apart, you know, we often give the creator of a theory or a framework or the experimenter who did the body of research, we give them the privilege of interpretation. And of course, it's mediated via journal articles and scientific domains and whatnot, and communities of scientists. But ultimately, it's like you can't argue with the person who says, well, I created this and this is what it means. Now, of course, artists have to face that all the time, because I can't remember who the gal is. I could look it up if anybody's interested. But she also has a lot of sort of organizational narrative research, and she says, you know, whenever I tell a story, there's actually like 3 stories that are happening. Like the story I tell, the story you hear, and the story we create together. And so, you know, art, that's the nature of art. You know, you create something and then it's completely out of your control. And, you know, you may have, like, if you created an idea, I remember hearing from Howard Gardner, who created the theory of multiple intelligences. You guys have probably all heard of that. It's like, you know, there's kinesthetic intelligence, there's mathematical intelligence. Like, he came up with this idea that it wasn't just, you know, one measurable thing that you can give people an IQ test for. It was ages ago. But then he found in some countries they were using this as basically an argument to sort of categorize and pigeonhole people and put them in like a track, like a developmental track, almost like the military did with IQ tests. And so it's fascinating. You don't always get to prevent your tool from being used for evil. That was a really weird tangent, which I'm not sure addresses Bartism at all. Apologies.
Dave has raised his hand, Sue.
I see.
I just wanted to, I mean, the Bartism one I think is interesting. And the modern organizational storytelling movement, I think, doesn't understand it. It focuses on a story and a performance. Whereas if you look at the bardic tradition, it's the bards knew a whole series of anecdotal data, and they moved around between communities and they picked up more anecdotes and they interwove a tale with their audiences. So the bard was effectively a catalyst. And I think that's important because when we started to write down fairy stories, we lost their ability to make meaning because we made them static. Yeah. And there's also some I was going to send it to you anyway, Sue. There's some interesting stuff just come out in Nature about memory may be linguistic, not photographic. Yeah, and that's actually fascinating because if memory is linguistic, it means human beings evolved to hold memory as abstractions, not as concrete memories. Yeah, and that would fit in with that. But I think the key thing about the bardic memory is more like the ants. It's the bards are moving around. They have to adapt politically to the context. So the story they tell reflects the politics of the environment they're in. And it is this constant weaving. It's what any good conference speaker does. They don't know what they're going to say until they stand up and speak because the audience has to give feedback before you present. Right? And I think we've lost that interactivity of communication.
Yeah, I really, you brought what Donald McLean brought, which I left out, which is which I think is important to note, which is the bard was sent out by the king, like to sort of travel from village to village to village, and if there was going to be a war, he was supposed to sort of amp them up, but he was also the other way, as you say, each village he was listening and hearing and weaving what he was noticing together to bring things back as well. It was very dynamic.
Just a qualification, the bards weren't sent out by the king. The bards exist independently of the king. They often challenge them.
Well, okay, I'm going to have to defer.
The kings
on
or the
that.
princes would get kudos by sponsoring them or giving them hospitality. So that there was huge high status in the bardic tradition. In fact, it was probably more powerful than some princes, because the princes relied on the bards to tell the story of their deeds. So yeah, it's an independent, it still is. If you go into the Irish storytelling tradition, the Irish Sonatis, they're still a group independent. They always have been in terms of the way they interact. It's a master apprentice model.
I did not know that. So in the case of like kind of amping people up to go to war, maybe that information was on an equal footing as the information they were picking up from villages. It was simply being woven in.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically, if you went to war in feudal times, you told the people to come and they just had to perform. I mean, there wasn't any voluntary act. The voluntary, if you look at some of the things like the Children's Crusade, then that's more of a sort of trope starting to spread. Yeah, and it may or may not have orators in it. But the bardic tradition, which is what you're talking about, was hearth. It was going into hearths. It was in the evenings. It was the entertainment. It was the meaning making. And a good bard was sponsored by, and actually they had a lot of power over princes because of the stories they told. So, and remember, most bardic traditions don't have kings. They have princes. That's very different.
So, one of the reasons why I wanted to get a feel of the landscape here, at least in terms of domains and context, was because I am a generalist. I am in other words, a dilettante. And I figured I don't want to like espouse expertise on something where there's someone in the room like Dave who has so much more knowledge about a history or a culture, for instance, Bardism. But so I'm wondering, would you all humor me a little bit and just in the chat, unless you're willing to, coming on the screen is fine too, or chatting. I'd like to hear in that chat, I'd like to see some of people's domains, either your personal domain or your context where you work, and or the domain that you first heard about complexity from. Like, what was it that introduced the idea to you? And we can just keep that going. Like, don't feel like you have to do it right this instant, but sure. Unless, we still got a half an hour, and I'm not hearing a lot of questions, but I really want to, like, play my silly reindeer games. Trace, you took yourself off mute. Does that mean you have something to say? I don't know. You put yourself off mute.
No. I'll have to peek at my notes here. I just love the piece of the camera snapshots of time and how it's revealed what we're actually seeing, and thinking again back to organizations where everything is at one little line. It feels not complex. And now, of course, nothing's new. It's all been complex, but now it's just a great way to think about what are people now seeing that they're calling what they once called clear, they're now calling complex or chaotic, all just maybe from a different viewpoint. I know that might be a hot button here saying it like that.
Ooh, Brian Eno reference in the chat. For sure, he's got that deck of cards too.
You knew it was going to happen.
Oh, right. Is that like a common thing? Okay. And I just real quick, if I don't, can we save the chat, Jocko and Barbara? I think I can do it, but I just want to have another.
Yeah, it's saved with the recording, so okay, I'll send it to you.
Awesome. It's interesting. I used a lot of paper crafting today's sort of content, and over and over again. I'm just going to keep talking if nobody else is. But I noticed this thing, Dave. You shared I'll just use the word bastardization of the Stacy matrix-ish thinking, and it sparked some Twitter debate about whether design tools are useful for chaos. And Joyce and I
so bad, Sue. It was so bad.
I know. Okay,
Yeah,
not even talking.
Design tools. I mean, it was just so bad. It was unbelievably bad. Yeah.
Well, so hang on. I have a point here. So Joyce and I have lots of conversations about Conneving because she's heard me go on about it for years, and now she's really getting into using it with groups. And one of the things we often talk about is the difference in how one might respond to chaos depending on whether you fell off the cliff or you waded in on purpose, shallow dive. And so that was what came to my mind in that situation was if I take the shallow dive every single day, practically, I do a design innovator's compass is one of my favorite tools. And I did add my tools onto that board, the Kumu map. But as Simon Wardley is fond of pointing out, if you're, in the middle of fighting a war and you're trying to figure out what to do you want to like whip out a flip chart and do a SWOT diagram? No, but neither do you want to do a Wardley map in that moment. I would suggest, like Dave, your suggestion is, restore order as soon as possible, like get directive. And I think that's an example for me of when we don't think together, we don't aerate the thought space and say, well, actually there are times when a design tool could be really handy. A shallow dive, for instance, into chaos. You fell off the cliff, not a good time to use that tool. Tracy.
Well, I guess I think of like that's what practice is about. I think a CPR or anything else, like there's tools, there's methodologies, and if you practice them and suddenly you're in chaos, they may be more accessible. It's not the time to maybe learn it or try to, I think it's just something that if it's second nature, the more you practice those second nature models and tools, the more you can access them in a chaotic moment. Is that what you're saying?
That's a really good point. That's not what I was saying, but I think it's a good point. Because neither could I whip out an innovator's compass in the moment, whether shallow dive or fall off the cliff. I couldn't do it if I didn't have skill using that tool.
But that's the back of the table napkin test. I mean, that's my disagreement with Simon. If you want a model to be used by executives, they've got to be able to draw it on the back of a table napkin. Yeah, and then you can use it in real time. Yeah, and I think, certainly in Conneving terms, the big insight we had with the EU Field Guide last year was that introduction of aporia. Your response to chaos is to create aporia, and then you have the opportunity to move into different domains. So.
Your response to chaos is to create it?
Yeah, no, to create aporetic moments. So unanswerable questions that force you to think differently, either physically or, we did that whole typology. Remember, Sue, the physical ones, the aesthetic ones, the linguistic ones. So ways of putting people into a position where they have to think differently about a problem.
So, okay, I hear what you're saying. I don't remember that typology, by the way. But I'm a little confused by the suggestion that you're making that, so does it matter if we fell off the cliff or not? Because if I fell off the cliff, I don't want you creating aporia for me.
The principle we put in the field guide is if you're a leader, you don't make decisions, you coordinate, except in a crisis when you fall off the cliff. And then you make decisions to increase the options available to people. You don't try and resolve the crisis. Your decision making is about increasing options. Yeah, and then start to distribute decision making again.
Interesting. God, there's so many thoughts in my head.
Dave, will you
I'm
say
just-
that last sentence again?
Okay, so I mean, this is EU Field Guide, so it's written down in that, all right? So it basically says the role of leaders is to coordinate, not to decide. So people who work for you know better how to make the decisions than you do. Your job is to coordinate and interact and place in the main, right? You may give a sense of direction, which is the commander's intent stuff we worked on, which is narrative based, all right? So it's not precise, it's a sense of direction. If there's a major crisis, you have to act decisively, but you don't act decisively to resolve the problem because you can't. That will make you more vulnerable. You act decisively to increase the options available to people so that they can then start to make decisions, which start to shift you in the right direction. And one of the ways to do that is this concept of aporia, which comes from Derrida. Yeah, and if Shin's on the call, she can explain it better than I can. Yeah, and aporia in Derrida is, Derrida says if you can answer a question, it's not a question, it's a process. If you can't answer a question, then that's a useful question. Because if you can't answer a question, you have to think or act differently. And that's what you want in that sort of environment.
You know, I really appreciate this. Dave, you and I come from like opposite ends of the spectrum. I think you think very well at the whole collective level. I am a very introspective person, so I often need to anchor it in my personal experience. And that experience of falling off the cliff for me was one in which I discovered in, I think it was 1999, that my husband was a heroin addict. And it was a cascading failure, let's say. All the rules of like how I thought I should navigate life collapsed. And I found a really great addictions counselor, even though it was my husband was the one that was in recovery. And I'd never been in therapy in my life. And I remember sharing with my friends that things that my counselor would say to me, things like, no men. I'd be like, and my friends would be like, whoa, that sounds like an awfully directive therapist. And I'm trying on what you're saying in that context, Dave, and it really fits for me because he could not solve my problem. If he solved my problem, that was a problem. But he could set up sort of heuristics and rules for me to explore new options. I mean, this sounds really kind of trite, but even the exposure to Alcoholics Anonymous, or in my case, Al-Anon and Nar-Anon, the idea that I didn't have as much control as I thought I had, and that I actually had a lot more control than I thought I had, was sort of an example I'm hearing of what Dave's talking about, where it is increasing my options, because there's all kinds of things that I could do that I'm not doing. So I know this, like, we tend to go towards the team org society level in a lot of these conversations, and I welcome that, but I often find that the first person is missing. And so I just want to keep at least offering that first person perspective. I cannot wait to read this chat. It's going to be after the fact. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say
Joyce,
there's some stuff going down in the chat that we should probably.
it's so good
bring in at
though.
some point.
I actually value it. I value that I can dig into that later.
Okay,
Tracy.
Joyce, you ask a question, and then we'll talk about the chat.
Yeah, just a quick thing. And Subi, you know me, I think I struggle with the formulaic. I think at times options might be the total thing. And another time, if it, like, maybe there is an answer and it just cuts through and it helps. So how do you say it's just always about options? Or like, if somebody has something and it works and the offering It's like, oh, great, thank you. It I didn't even see that. Like somebody gives a directive and it works. I don't
It's
know.
high
if
risk.
it
It's
works.
high risk. It may be true. It's high risk. The problem is in that sort of chaos complexity type area, you know that you don't have enough information. And therefore, if you think you know the answer, it's a high risk. I mean, you may have to do it. And I would say that to Sue, that's personal as well as everything else. You know, you see that with, for example, alcoholics. People try and detox them, and that's the wrong way to do it. It makes it worse, not better.
You know, Joyce, I'm also hearing, so Joyce has given me some of my main directives in life. In that era, I actually wasn't the heroin addict husband. It was actually later when a high altitude mountaineer and I broke up, and I was just a mess. I was like, oh, Joyce, you know, I called Joyce in tears, and she, you know, I was just a walking bundle of declarations about the world, and she would give me these little homework sort of directives, like invite unknowing was one of them. Another was avoid declarations. Just see what it's like. Go through a day and see if you can just not make any declarations. And that, to me, Joyce, I hear that less as like it's partnering. It's not necessarily leadership. You partnered with me in the moment. And in terms of Dave, what you were saying about increasing options, sort of in I would say local, so that leadership is more coordinative. It reminds me of something that Hari Hahn said when you and she visited the Learning Innovations Lab. And she said, you know, you have a power problem when the people who are in a position to act on like to act in and to improve the situation don't have the power to do so, or perhaps the insight or allowance. They don't allow themselves to do it, which is the sort of situation that I was facing, in that I just didn't think that I could do some things. Like, I remember once my therapist told me, I don't think you should talk to your mother-in-law anymore. And I was like, what? I can do that? If my friend had said, you just need to stop talking to her, I never would have considered that as a viable option. I would have thought that was like, you can't not talk to your mother-in-law. She's going through the same thing you are. But so the power thing seems like, oh, okay, this threads back to something that David Woods talks about, the capacity for maneuver and what he calls reciprocity. So basically he says that if at any point in a distributed system, some agent or adaptive group, it could be a single person, it could be a team, it could be a department, it could be an organization, for instance, in our supply chain thing, if anything is reaching its capacity for maneuver where it can no longer absorb or digest the change that's coming at it, it can set off a cascading failure. Okay, no surprise there. But what he says is that this is avoided all the time through regular working, that the people who are close to the point of the failure often just step up and help. They just take over some of the load there. They lend some of their capacity for maneuver. So the not failing is happening all the time. And then when we do have the cascading failures, Wood says, we often look for that sort of single point of failure. Who's to blame? What caused this? And so there's, I think one of the things I love about complexity is that it allows the threading together. I always feel like a sort of a kid in a candy store. It's like improv to have these models in your head and be able to play with them in useful ways to think together. If that's what it feels like to me, it feels like improv. Alicia, you have a smile on your face.
She's been going wild in the chat.
I was gonna say, or philosophy.
Yeah.
I like this, Alicia, that idea that you posted in the chat about triptychs. I mean, one of the things I always take from those is the idea that the capacity for each of those panels exists in each of us all the time.
But more importantly, the capacity to integrate.
Great, yeah, and that's, yeah.
So it's left to the viewer or the camera, in Sue's example, to integrate them, whereas once perspective gets figured out, they're in your face. This is the perspective that you have to take. And that's the beginning of the end of civilization. Yeah. Yeah. And we're not that comfortable with that anymore, although maybe that's what deconstruction tries to do. To not give you the unitary perspective or the background that you're supposed to have in order to adopt that unitary perspective and agree with everybody else and so on. Anyway, you go.
I like the references to art and creativity. I think my Kumu map says something like learning and creating. I don't remember who it was. Somebody like Dewey said all learning is invention, which I think is a really fascinating idea. David Bohm also has some really cool ideas about art. As he talks about generative order as sort of the I wonder if when he uses the word order, he doesn't mean it in the way that Alicia used the word constraint. And he talks about order in art. And it's a fascinating read. Actually, I link to, or I don't link, but I try and leave a lot of breadcrumbs for folks that want to explore some of these things on that board. There's references to papers and whatnot. Thanks for coming, Trent. I see he's signing off in the chat. I don't know about you guys. I don't know how you do this for 2 hours. It's a lot.
Well, I'm going to ask if there's any questions because Sue needs a little break to gather her thoughts. So, I mean, I've got a million of them, but I can ask her those anytime. So you guys should really figure it out and come up with the questions you have. This has been a very wide-ranging discussion. And I see, Sue, can you say something about Krishnamurti how Krishnamurti influences your work?
So, I will admit that was actually a quote that I had. It's attributed to Krishnamurti in the opening of Marshall Rosenberg's book, Nonviolent Communication. I have not been able to find the original source of that quote, but the quote that Bao is referring to is that observation without evaluation is the highest form of intelligence. And while I have not read Krishnamurti, I was a big yogi, and I fortunately found yoga before I fell off the cliff. I'm not sure how I would have survived it otherwise. It was a real refuge. And actually, yoga is where I was introduced to the concept of like felt experienced paradox. I don't know if
Krishnamurti was a big influence on me when I was about 20 to 22, 23. Just really kind of reframed things to me. I tried to reread it in my 30s and 40s, and it was sort of silly. Not that it was bad in that sense. It was just I had moved to a different place. So I'm always careful about whether recommending Krishnamurti or not, but that's just me, because what that quote refers to, he talks about quite a bit.
Good to know. I often find that, Jocko, with books that I thought was really impactful. I go back and read it, and I'm like, what?
Yeah, without actually taking anything away from it, but it's time and place.
More questions? If there's no more questions, I do also have this kind of really interesting snippet from Bohm on the orders of art, if anybody wants to hear it.
Yes, okay. I do.
So this is in his book, Science, Order, and Creativity, co-written with David Peat, and it's in a section called Orders in Art. He says, what is particularly interesting about responding to a drawing or painting is the way in which the viewer interprets, decodes, and responds to this complexity of orders. And by complexity of orders, he had sort of laid out how, like, the meaning of a line only makes sense in the context of the drawing, in a sense. So that was what he's referring back to in previous pages. For in different historical periods and in different cultures, marks and interpretations are made in different ways. The art critic Ernst Gombrich refers to what he calls schema, an idea not too dissimilar to Kuhn's paradigms, which take the form of tacitly accepted conventions employed in the construction and viewing of a work of art. Within a given period, most artists employ particular schema, which are then absorbed unconsciously by the viewing public, who interpret the meaning of their works. When a school of art changes, the particular schemata are also transformed, and the public may at first consider the new work to be ugly, meaningless, or wrong. Until the new schema have been absorbed, the public are unable to interpret and integrate with their inner perceptions the work that stands before them. In one sense, therefore, an appropriate syntax has to be employed in reading the painting, just as a syntax is required to read and understand a novel or other piece of writing. What I think is really interesting about this is that I'm thinking about the story of, I think it's like, is it Stravinsky that wrote Rites of Spring, and there was like a riot? It's like people can't just experience, we're not blank slates at all. So the other thing that he talks about, which I don't, the generative order, one more little bit. He talks about the writing of a novel, which he discusses in the previous chapter before this one on the generative order and the implicate order. But he talks about a novel. Writing a novel is an example of a hierarchy that grows out of basic generative order with the author's mind through the generative subordinates of plot, character, atmosphere, means of expression, and so on. In addition, this generative order must be expressed within various conventional forms of syntax as they apply within the sentence, paragraph, and chapter to a tacit conventions of the novel. So basically, he talks about the larger generative order must serve the aesthetics of style, flow, and readability. So the complex hierarchical order that can be analyzed within a novel is never truly fixed. In a great work of art, it is dynamical and always used in a creative fashion.
Yeah, and within organizations, you often see that the stories that are generated are a product of the constraints that they've placed on the generation of stories.
Mm. Oh, that's really interesting. Wow. And also norms. I'm thinking about the way, so I'm a member of a Quaker meeting, and, you know, there's, like in most contexts, there's a lot of upheaval these days about inclusivity and diversity, and you know, there's, when people don't show up and play according to the culture of nice that has been the tradition and the history, there's a tendency to say, you know, it's not a fit, or you don't belong here, or that's not what Quakerism looks like. And so it's a little, if I'm understanding you, Barbara, it's this sort of a playing out of that. Like,
I mean, within organizations, there's often, like, you know, you can be generating narratives about the future, let's say, or the present of the company, but there are constraints that are often tacit, like we don't talk about the effects of climate change, you know, that of the effects our product have on the climate, or we don't talk about the effects that they have in this perspective. And so the constraints that you place on that generative field, right? If you ask people to come up with ideas, you know, you're automatically generating the same kinds of stories that you always wanted to have.
Maybe mandated as well, Barbara. I mean, I was reviewing a design with Ellie tonight for a sense maker project. And fundamentally, the client has said, I only want to hear positive stories from senior management about why this is working.
Yeah.
And you look at the political reality they're facing, and to be quite honest, you can't blame them. All right. I mean, yeah, they can all lose their jobs if they don't look on the bright side. But I mean, I'm writing a blog post about it in parallel on this at the moment with the image of sort of melting candles. Yeah, the longer you put off that sort of reality, the less light you have at the end of the day, because the candles will stutter and die because nobody will listen. And I think this is one of the dilemmas about complexity. You have to recognize the realities of where people are. And you can't just relapse into this lovely world that a lot of the systems thinkers guys do, which is let's all imagine a wonderful future place. And now we got our game P designed. We just have to say everybody has to play game B, and then the world will be a better place. And it's just farcical. Yeah, but you'll never get there. It's lotus eating. Sorry, I get worked up. I'm still angry about that one from earlier.
Well, it's tough, as you say. And it becomes, a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because the more positive stories you demand, the more you get, and the less likely you are to recognize your fall off the cliff or your tip into some other disaster zone. So yeah, it's this whole idea, Sue, that you brought up of this idea of a generative field is really interesting, and what goes into that, right? Because we're rife with stories of companies dismissing a great idea because it came from a department that wasn't known for generating great ideas. I mean, I think of even the internet and the hardware industry, right? These guys were going, this is a new thing. And they were like, it'll pass. We make hardware. And so they missed the next great iteration of their industry.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I did not share with y'all is I have not been in an organization in a really long time. Like when I left engineering in 2003-ish, 2006 maybe. So you all know that context. But I have some theoretical fodder from my time at Lila.
All right, well, it's coming up at 2. And so does anybody else have anything else they want to ask Sue or say to Sue? Sue, you make sure you tell everybody where they can, you've shared your Kumo board, but I know you have a Patreon and a couple of other things going on.
Yeah, you can find me on, the Twitter and
Well, we'll get everything up on the meetup page of the links that you want to share out. So we'll put that in a comment in the next couple of days, and we'll have this video up. Yep, it's easy.
Google my name and you'll find me everywhere.
Well, and in answer to what would you recommend someone that wants to get started learning more about complexity? Well, Sue's videos are a great place to start. Dave's blog is a great place to start. Alicia's book, Dynamics in Action, can be a little tough, but it's a great place to start. No, Alicia, I'm sorry, but I don't want to throw them in the deep end.
I have a whole bunch of books on that Kumu board that are ones that I found fun, like Figments of Reality and Stephen Johnson's Emergence. I mean, they're good intros, I think.
So I always find that the best meetups that I'm at are the ones where I have 15 tabs open to books or papers, and you have filled that for me. I have, a ton of tabs open, and it's all good stuff.
Awesome. I'm seeing a hand
up. Michael Hill raised his hand. Michael, do you want to unmute yourself? And
yes, Sue, and I'm going to apologize if the traffic and the rain starts again because I'm outside. I had a question in the chat because I am not good at the drawing and the music and all that. And I'm wondering if you have any heuristics that you kind of follow when you're creating your animations for balancing the art, the text, the spoken word, and the music that you add. Just as a heuristic or heuristics that help you do that.
That is one of those things, when they're in orgs, how you're always talking about implicit knowledge and expert knowledge. Like, I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm still early enough in my exploration that I don't have that sort of meta reflective awareness on how I do what I do. I gotta tell you, the hardest part is writing the script. That is where all the hard work comes in. If that story is dialed, and I use other people to judge when the story is dialed. I have my, people who edit, and I count syllables. Like, I try and really hone that story. And the rest is more like play, images and play. And if somebody tells me, can't hear your voice here, feedback is great. There's some harsh feedback. If you go to YouTube and look at the comments on those first 4 videos that I did in early grad school, there are some harsh comments on there about my bad balancing of audio and voiceover, etc.
Thank you. That's helpful, even if you don't think it was.
Awesome.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah, we'll save the chat. There's so much in the chat. It's hard to keep track of in real time. Dave, sorry. Well, Dave, it was great that you could stop by. Thank you. But Sue, I mean, we're coming up on the end of the hour. And Sue, this has been so great. I mean, we can't thank you enough. Anytime, you're welcome anytime you want to float some videos in front of the group or, share your latest thoughts.
I'm just going to put one plug in there. So for Joyce Hartpence here, who's shown up on the call, she has been working on a trust model. And it seems like it'd be really fun to play with and hear how she's playing with it in groups. It's a suitcase word. And I think that's what complexity also invites, is like, how do we build the sort of meaning landscape of what we mean by trust? So I would love it if Joyce managed to squeeze onto the docket at some point in the future.
Yeah, that's a big topic we've been having on the side, is trust and the nature of trust, and how that actually plays out is much more complex than most people would imagine. So it's on the tip of our heads, so to speak.
So Joyce, hit me up. You know where to find me. I'm everywhere.
I try to make it a simple form, hopefully usable, but in the spirit of complexity, a simplified, how do we bring this forward? Because so many people are really grappling with it. Thank you, Subi. Subi, thank you for an awesome 2 hours.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And we know Dave's criteria, Joyce, is the back of the napkin, which I think we can probably do with the trust model.
Well, Sue, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for coming and for hanging in there with us through 2 hours. We have some awesome guests coming up in the future, so make sure you tune in and keep your eye on the meetup page. And thanks again for coming.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. Good evening.